Okay, today is the scripture reading is the Sunday of Zacchaeus, and a very famous story, and it's a story that's preparing us already, by the way, for the beginning of Lent. Next week we're going to start the first phase of the three phases that gets us into Lent, the pre-Lenten phase and then the actual phase of Lent, and then the third phase is Holy Week itself. And all those services are geared not simply to say, like, have a historical remembrance of what happened to Jesus, but Lent was designed to prepare us for baptism, to prepare people for the change that was going to take place in their lives in encountering Christ. And that's why, as a sidebar, for many centuries, there was the belief that the parousia, the second appearance and final appearance of Jesus, would take place at Pascha. So even for people already membered in the church, it wasn't just for the people who were going to get baptized at Pascha, because that was the time to get baptized. Separating baptism from the liturgy sadly came about because of some anomalous situations. Originally, every baptism was done in the liturgy, and every baptismal liturgy was primarily done at Pascha itself, to connect with the death and resurrection of Christ, and so forth. But it was not only for the church to prepare to fast for those who were going to enter into the community, but in that encounter with Christ, even prepare because of the fact that there might be when Jesus will appear even when we celebrate Pascha. And imagine if we approached Pascha with that kind of attitude, that we're going to have an encounter with Christ. So that heightened, if you will, the enthusiasm and the emphasis, that even with those who are going to join the church, that they might be getting baptized, and suddenly when they come out of the water and take the Eucharist, that when they take the Eucharist, there will be this sudden explosion, and they will be partaking the fulfillment of the Eucharist, which is the marriage supper of the Lamb, with Jesus appearing to finalize everything that he began in his death and resurrection. This is also the gospel that's tied to house blessings. It's very tied to house blessings. And the reason with this story is very powerful because it is about our lives, where we live, how we live, and so on and so forth. Now, just by way of exegesis, Luke ties this, and we have to understand that the way chapters are divided in the Bible came about by only 5-6 centuries ago to help people memorize better. There's a story in chapter 18 of Luke about the blind man in Jericho. And Luke, in one way, wants these two stories to be connected and these two men to be connected. Now, Jericho is a very powerful image in the mind of an Israelite. Any Jewish person who would think of Jericho would immediately think of the old story of Joshua. Joshua entering into the promised land, Joshua being given the land, but there to take it over. The city of Jericho, of course, that was going to resist them. Them trying to find out how they could take over the city of Jericho. The story of Rahab, of course, the prostitute who hides the Israelite spies, and the whole very powerful story there. But the way the place is taken, and they do admit, archaeologists, that there was some kind of an earthquake when they've dug around Jericho, that there was an earthquake that brought down a lot of the walls that are there. That the way in the story of Joshua, the way they bring down the city is by processing around the city and then finally blowing the trumpets, and the idea that God himself would be there to take over the city and give them the land. And they would simply just cooperate with him. Now we have, like I said, a blind man. Jesus comes to Jericho. Now this Yeshua, this Joshua, this Yeshua, this Jesus, like the first one in the Old Testament, would come to Jericho. And of course there's a blind man, and then there's of course Zacchaeus. And both have some interesting things here, okay? Because part of this also, like the original Joshua story, that's trying to say and define what does it mean to be Israel? What does it mean for Israel to take the land, to see God's presence and kingdom on earth, to be manifest on earth as in heaven, as we like to say in the Lord's Prayer. And that's what this story is about, seeing that reality of what it means to be Israel, because he's come to manifest that reality. But there's a connection between the two. There's a connection. And there's contrasts. Zacchaeus is small in stature, but large in wealth. And Luke likes to really highlight that. We don't really have many descriptions, physical descriptions of people, but Luke makes a point to describe Zacchaeus, that he's small, and the contrast of this guy being very short. He's got limitations. He's the head tax collector, and he's very wealthy. The beggar is disabled and poor. Zacchaeus is curious to see, and this is important because a lot of translations will bring this out, because some translations say he's curious to see Jesus. The Greek actually says to see esteem who he is, meaning who he is in his being. Who is this? Who is this? But he's doing it out of curiosity. The beggar, though, wants Jesus because he's desperate. He has a need fulfilled. Zacchaeus doesn't realize or think that he has a need. He doesn't have a need. Zacchaeus is unaware of that. The beggar clearly is aware of his need. Zacchaeus winds up having Jesus invite him to come to him, whereas the beggar is yelling for Jesus to come to him. Now there's a connection, again, between the two as well as a contrast. Both are visually impaired. Both are visually impaired. The blind man obviously can't see due to his handicap. Zacchaeus can't see because of the crowd. Both are outcasts. Both are outcasts. Both are intensely disliked. And remember how tax collectors were seen. We can't imagine in this culture. I mean, people may joke and grumble about the IRS. That's nothing near to what they felt about tax collectors, because you have to understand they saw the Romans in the same way many people in Europe saw Nazis. And when you had a tax collector of one of your own people who's working for those people, collaborating with those people, and not only collaborating, but using their position to gain their own personal power, their own personal security, and so forth, they were clearly hated. They were hated. A tax collector could have your spouse, your kids sold off for slavery. They could do whatever they wanted. They wielded power, and they would have the force of Rome behind them. They're both hindered by the crowds. The blind man hears Jesus in town. He starts yelling, "Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me." The crowd starts yelling, "Shut up, leave him alone." Zacchaeus, and probably on purpose, can't see because of the crowd of people because he's short. But there's a connection also in the sense that because of the dominant trait that would seem to define their limitations, like a lot of people, they push themselves harder than a lot of other people would. They're both very humbled. I mean, I don't know what it'd be like. You cry out for Jesus and people tell you to shut up, and there would be an embarrassing thing. And there seems to be this incredible thing that in order to really have an encounter with Christ, we have to be humbled. Zacchaeus runs ahead, and we know he climbs up a sycamore tree. And it had to be very embarrassing. Can you imagine? He's hoping nobody sees him. Nobody sees him. The blind guy, he's sitting there yelling for Jesus. And the crowds are telling him to shut up. They're trying to hinder him. And Luke says he's crying out repeatedly, all the louder, all the louder. He's trying to drown out their voices with his prayer. He's drowning out their voices with his prayer. And it's kind of embarrassing because, you don't want people to dislike you. You're a beggar. You're dependent on their charity. You're dependent on their their goodwill towards you. You're very dependent. And so it's embarrassing to have to yell like that. But he's going to do it because he sees his need is great. Zacchaeus, on the other hand, climbs up the tree, right? And to his shock, when Jesus, which both, can you imagine this, both have the similar, by the way, experience where the beggar suddenly in his darkness has some people come and pick him up and like help him walk towards Jesus, and he hears a voice in his darkness say, "What do you want me to do for you?" Zacchaeus doesn't see Jesus in the same way. He climbs up the tree and he's looking, suddenly hears a voice below him that says, "Zacchaeus, hurry, come down." And I'm sure all the crowd must have suddenly looked up and started laughing, snickering, and everything else that went with that. It was humbling. It was humiliating. But sometimes that's what our egos need. We need the bubbles burst a lot of times. Because in our egos, we don't realize how much we need God. We don't realize how much we need God. We will do other things. We will be desperate to get this and that. We will be desperate to watch this TV show. We will be desperate to get to this sporting event. We will be desperate to get to this and that and the other thing, to make that sale, and so on and so forth. But do we see our desperate need for God? And the connection also between the two is their lifestyles are radically changed in the encounter with Jesus. And that's what the church is preparing everybody for, that in the encounter, if you really have a genuine encounter with Christ, there will be a radical change. Now, it's obvious with the beggar what happens. He gains his sight. He doesn't have to sit and beg anymore. He can actually maybe get a job, make his own income, and so on and so forth. Zacchaeus will change too. Zacchaeus' lifestyle will change radically. And both because, number one, in Jesus, God sees the uniqueness of each one of them the way he sees the uniqueness of each one of us. He sees what we are valued. God sees how we are valued and worth the life of his own child. God sees that. And in the encounter, the beggar and Zacchaeus get to see that too. What they encounter is how God sees them. Do we see how God sees us? We get so caught up in the crowds in our lives, whatever crowds our lives are, the fears, the anxieties, the this, the that, where we don't make room for anything else. We let ourselves just be dragged along. We just let ourselves get dragged along and have every excuse in the book for being dragged along. And it's interesting when Zacchaeus comes down, when he hears the crowd grumbling. And in fact, the Greek word that's very powerful, diagonizon, in Greek means not simply to murmur, it means like to groan, like, oh, geez, I can't believe Jesus is going to go into his house. And let me say something else with that. When Jesus says, I must come to your house, that Greek word they, that is roughly translated, doesn't mean simply must. It means must in the sense of the divine purpose, the divine providence, the divine plan. In other words, Zacchaeus, I must. This is orchestrated by God, Zacchaeus. I must come into your house today. And when we have house blessings, that's the same idea, because the prayers will talk about, as you entered under the roof of Zacchaeus, God's divine plan is to come into our house. And when we see what that means, it affects a change. And, Zacchaeus is hearing the crowd grumble and groan, and, geez Louise, this guy's a bum. He's a rotten, lousy person. He's made money and himself wealthy off the backs and the blood, literally even, because like I said, the tax collectors had power. They had power. They were feared. They were feared. And Luke says, Zacchaeus stands still. It brings him up short. It stops him. It stops him. And we need those moments where something hits us and we stop. Because again, part of that humbling, the humiliation. Can you imagine how Zacchaeus, he realizes what they're saying is true. What these people are feeling is true about him. Is true about him. But instead of running away and hiding and just saying, I'll get these bums and going back to his old lifestyle, he stops. He stops in front of Christ. And he makes a statement that talks about the change that's being affected in his life. Lord, half of everything I have I will give to the poor and destitute. And if I have defrauded, this is a sign that the idea that in an encounter, the lifestyle changes. Just like the beggar's lifestyle would change by gaining sight. His whole lifestyle would change. It's not just he gets a little religious and he does religious things, and maybe he's going to go to synagogue more often and da-da-da-da-da, and light a few more candles every so often, drop in and say hi to God whenever he's got the time and need for it. No, there's an idea that a whole lifestyle changes, a whole lifestyle. It's like when we get married, for those of us who get married, or we get a brand new job, or we're going to graduate school, or children come into our lives, or what have you. It's a lifestyle change. It's a lifestyle change. Half of my goods I give to the poor, and if I have defrauded anyone, I'm going to give 4 times over. In other words, if I ripped off anybody, now this is very powerful, because this is something we lose in our modern world, where, like Dietrich Bonhoeffer used to say, we have cheap grace. We think if I just ask for forgiveness, that fixes, instead of the idea of making reparation in the sense of restitution. Now, in the book of Deuteronomy, it says, if you have stolen anything, you not only give back what you stole, but you give 20% on top. So if somebody ripped off $100, they'd give 120. But Zacchaeus goes, if I ripped off 100, I'm giving 400 on top, meaning a total of $500. Now, what did that do to his lifestyle? Because what did that do to his budget? It changed his life. It changed his lifestyle. The encounter with Jesus will change our lives. It will change our lives. And suddenly we will see, after being humbled, after the fact that all these other things that we thought defined us or should define us, whether it be the things we think are so great about us that they must be this and that and the other thing, or the things that are so bad about us, that in the end it's how we see, like I said, how we see how God sees us, which is out of this incredible love. This incredible love. It's transformation, it's transfiguration. And so being part of the church, being part of Israel, because salvation is about being in that marital, intimate partnership with God. It doesn't mean just dropping in, and when I die, if I was a nice enough guy and the Rotary Club will remember me, and blah, 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 I'll go to this place where I can float around like a bodiless spirit and blah, 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 blah. No, it's about being in this partnership with God in this age and the next, to work with him for the rebirth of all things, to be with Christ on his project, to see as he sees not only myself but everyone else. And I will see other people the degree to which I understand how I'm seen by God. Now, according to the tradition of the church, good old Clement of Alexandria, who had a lot of traditions about what happened with Jesus and many of the people that followed afterwards, and so forth, which fills in some of the gaps here and there, that there's the tradition that Zacchaeus, and maybe he helped the blind guy kickstart his income and get going, but Zacchaeus himself will later be connected to Peter in Peter's travels, Peter the Apostle. And that he will even go and help build churches in what's modern day France. And he's commemorated actually in the month of April. He's got his own feast day, and he's called Isia Apostolos. He's an equal to the apostles. He's a co-worker with the apostles. He's involved in apostolic ministry. There's the times God tells us to come down. When we feel humiliated, hurt. But like one of the things in the Synaxarion of the church, the little writings that say what we're commemorating every day and so on and so forth on a daily basis. He tells Zacchaeus to come down in order to bring him up. He brings him down from the bottom, brings him to the bottom to bring him to the top. And so as we approach Pascha, that's what we're looking at here. And our involvement in the worship and life of the church is to let that organically soak into us. The way we throw holy water around. The idea that when we go bless a house, for example, that's what's taking place, that we are reaffirming that this is the reality God has given me a home, that this is God's home, that God lives in this home, and that because he lives in my house, my lifestyle is different. My lifestyle is different. And then I start to see that everything I do and am, I come into an awareness, which is what ultimately prayer is, the awareness of God's presence, and that whatever we do, whether we're drinking a cup of coffee, whether we're sitting around just reading a book or what have you, we're doing it in the presence of God. Because God is at home with us. God has made his home with us. And he's like Zacchaeus, he's made us a son of Abraham. He's made us and restored us to be part of the Israel, which is what is manifest when we gather as community. To be the Israel, the community that's in that intimate partnership with God, working on his project to rebirth and bring humanity, and through that humanity rebirth all of creation to the destiny that he has inaugurated in and through Jesus. And Luke, God bless him, he's with Paul in saying that God has redefined and reconfigured what it means to be an Israelite. It's no longer, of course, ethnically Jewish. It is about now the whole world being grafted onto the trunk of the people of Israel, whose root is founded in God himself through the faithfulness of Jesus. And that's why really trying to soak this in, one of the things many priests will recommend, and I would too, we put the scriptures in for the week every day, but like one thing I would recommend along the way is all the calendars will have the Sunday readings, at least the gospel readings. I would recommend a lot of times read it ahead of time, prepare ourselves. When the deacon or the priest says, let us be attentive, to pay attention, to let this soak in. To let this soak in. To let these words become incarnate. And of course, ultimately in the context of worship, where it really gestates. It really gestates. To see that reality of how God sees us and values us and wants us to be part of the Israel that partners with him to rebirth this world.